Welcome to Series 5 of the Latte Lounge podcast. Join me, Katie Taylor, as we talk balancing hormones, busting myths, breaking taboos, boosting libidos, and bolstering confidence. Why not grab a coffee, take a seat, or go for a walk and join us in the Latte Lounge as we chat all things midlife, menopause, and beyond. With thanks to our friends at Youth and Earth for making this podcast possible. Now, I often feel like bone health and osteoporosis is one of those forgotten symptoms of menopause. It's very easy for us to focus on the symptoms that are troubling us in the here and now, like hot flushes or sleep issues or brain fog. And I totally get that we might not be in a place to give much thought to some of those longer term symptoms and the ones you can't feel or see straight away, like our bone health. So today is all about taking half an hour or so to give you the essentials on bone health and osteoporosis, so you know exactly what it's all about and how we can reduce our risk of getting osteoporosis with some really practical tips. Joining me today is Dr. Kate Bunyan. Kate is the medical director at Stella, who are the experts who power our online menopause clinic, the Latte Lounge Plus. And Kate's a regular guest in the Latte Lounge and always packs in so much helpful information. So I know you're going to find this conversation really interesting and useful. So welcome, Kate. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Katie. It's great to be back on the Latte Lounge with you.
Well, listen, I thought it'd be really helpful if we could start by perhaps having a look at why is bone health so important, particularly as we age?
It is a great question. It's one of those areas where we don't feel our bones aging. But just like the rest of us, they absolutely are. So our skeletons are what supports us. It's what gets us around, up on our feet, and gets us doing everything that we need to. So strong bones are very much needed to help literally support us. And when we develop problems with our bone strength, then that can lead to more fractures, which are themselves painful. And you can also have a reduction in the quality of your life because of those fractures. So maintaining strong bones and understanding what contributes to our bone strength is a really important part for all of us at any stage of our lives.
Yeah, and it's funny, isn't it? Because when you're younger, you're just, as a child, you're running around all the time. So you're always, doing some sort of exercise and working those bones. And then as a teenager, perhaps you're playing sport or you're walking. And I think when we all start working and perhaps we're leading a much more sedentary life, whether you're sitting at a desk job or behind the wheel of a car or whatever, it certainly didn't enter my mind that I should look after my bone health until I had problems with it. And that was, personally, I thought, oh, I'm 40, I'm going to start running just because why not? And actually, I realized I had hip dysplasia and it was a really bad idea to just go. But then particularly during perimenopause, when I suddenly had these aching joints and I thought, well, what's going on with that? So we do talk a lot in the Latte Lounge about osteoporosis. And I think us midlife women think, oh, that's just happens to, much older women. And that's, actually simply not true. And I think if we can get ahead of the game and prevent that, then we're winning in terms of staying healthy and fit and well for as long as possible. So what is osteoporosis? Let's actually define what it is, first of all.
So that's a great starting point, because once we understand what it is that we're dealing with, then we can start to understand how we can manage it. So our bones are made up of a very solid outer cortex, an outer shell, and inside the bone is weaved into a more of a honeycomb structure. It's all based on proteins, and our calcium then reinforces that honeycomb structure. As we all get older, that honeycomb structure starts to break down, because the way our bones work, they are constantly living. So our bones are breaking down and making up. We call that resorption and then formation, and that's bone remodeling. That's happening all the time from the moment we are born, pretty much until the day we die. So we've got this constant cycle of breaking down and forming again. Osteoporosis happens when the breaking down isn't matched by the making up. So we have more bone loss than we do bone growth and development. And that means that the inside of that honeycomb becomes bigger, the holes get bigger, the structure and the network gets much more airy, more porous, which is where that porosis bit comes from, osteoporosis. And the outer shell also starts to become thinner. So we lose the strength in our shell and we lose the strength in that honeycomb network, and that can lead to increased fractures. So osteo, bone, porosis, porous, basically means our bones are getting to be more holy on the inside and thinner on that outer shell.
Oh, that's fascinating. It's a great way of describing it, actually. I'm imagining a sort of a crunchy bar in the inside of that.
Perfect. That's exactly it. It's like a crunchy bar where if you took away the delicious chocolate, then you'd have that tight shell on the outside and then the crunchy bit in the middle. It's exactly what our bones look like.
Oh, gosh, it's so interesting. So look, I mean, is this particularly an issue for women in midlife? I mean, what is that sort of link between perimenopause and menopause and our hormones, when it comes to bone health? Well, what is it in our hormones that does, affect that sort of porous structure?
So that's such an important question, one that even the experts don't 100% understand how estrogen is involved in this dance between the cells that break down bone and the cells that make up bone. And usually they're in this happy cycle, as I've heard it described, this dance of keeping together and keeping that bone fit and healthy. But an estrogen plays some part in that by acting either to help make those cells work better or to actually stimulate those cells. As I say, not entirely sure, but what we do see is once that estrogen levels start to fall, that balance for that dance gets all out of kilter. So we have more bone breakdown than we do bone formation. But it is important to say this happens to everybody. This is a process that also accompanies just aging. So men do get osteoporosis as well.
Actually, I was going to ask you if it affects men as well. So I mean, obviously there is this link with the reduction in estrogen. But are there any sort of other causes or risk factors for poor bone health and osteoporosis that we should all be aware of?
Absolutely. So first of all, women seem to be at a little bit more of a disadvantage because we have physically smaller skeletons. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're just shorter than men on average, but it means that our bones themselves tend to be lighter and tend to be smaller. So we start off with less bone structure than men do, comparatively, and talking about statistical averaging here. And then we know that with estrogen dropping off in the way it does at menopause, we see that sudden decline in a way that men only see a more gentle decline. But we also know there's lots of other risk factors for osteoporosis. So there are some medications that will impact whether or not you develop osteoporosis. Particularly steroids can have a big impact, again, on this dance between bone growth and bone formation and bone loss. We also see a connection with other sorts of medical problems, so rheumatoid arthritis, hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism, parathyroid disease, Crohn's disease, celiac disease, strokes. All these things affect either the way we absorb the nutrients we need to help make our bones grow, so calcium and vitamin D particularly, or they affect the way our bone cells work, and that then causes the problems. Or they impact the way we use our skeleton, and that impacts how strong our bones are. So you can sort of break it down into those groups of either medications or other medical problems that are either causing us to absorb differently, use differently, or just find ourselves with problems of actually making the bones properly with the cells that we have.
Yeah, it's interesting. You touched on vitamin D, and I often hear a lot about, because we're not, especially here in the UK, there's very little sunlight, and we should all be sort of taking vitamin D to help with our bones and obviously skin and hair and nails and pretty much everything else. And I do want to go on to treatment options, but before we look at sort of the things we can do, lifestyle factors or medical treatment options, I mean, what are some of the other symptoms, and how would something like osteopenia or osteoporosis be diagnosed? I mean, obviously a fracture or a breakage, I assume is quite obvious, but is there anything else that symptom-wise you might think, hang on, that's not right?
So from a symptom point of view, none whatsoever. That's one of the things about this, because we don't have any feeling of bone loss, then sometimes the first time we know anything is wrong is because we fracture something through something fairly minor. And the clinicians will describe that as being a fragility fracture. So something where maybe you've fallen just from your own height, you've tripped over and you've landed, which is why we so commonly associate this with fractures of the wrist or fractures of the hip. When people haven't been horse riding or motorbikes or anything like that, they've just naturally tripped over and managed to break quite a significant bone as part of that. You can also see it in bone fractures of the back, and sometimes that can happen in people with osteoporosis without there being much of a trigger for it, just simply because of the weight of the spine all stacked up on each other can crush one of those bones through the fact that it isn't as strong, and that then leads to pain. So the only real symptom of osteoporosis is the pain related to actual fractures. You're right about the diagnosis, that there are ways other than just fractures of being able to diagnose that you have this problem with your bones. And also, I love the use of the word osteopenia in there. So osteopenia is something that we talk about, meaning thinner bones. It's not actually a medical problem. It's just a state that describes the fact that our bones have gone from the average healthy young adult through a process where we're not as thin as we might grade it if we called it osteoporosis, but we're somewhere in between healthy and not yet osteoporotic. And that's osteopenia, just meaning weaker bones or thinner bones. And we see that if we have certain types of scans. So the main scan that we use for identifying bone strength or bone density is what we're looking for in the scan. It's called a DEXA scan. So it's a dual energy X-ray absorptiometry test, DXAA. So we're looking at those tests, and that's basically looking at the bone density seen at 2 points, usually in the top of the hip, in the neck of femur, and possibly also looking at a vertebrae. And they're looking to compare that to what would be statistically average for a young adult, and then grading it as a normal density as compared to that standard point, that in that osteopenia range where it's not quite as strong as it was, but it hasn't reached any clinical relevance, and then an osteoporotic range where we are seeing a bone density that is even less than that. But a DEXA scan on its own isn't enough. We also factor in different lifestyle factors, because we all have and have always had a different strength to our skeletons. So a number on a scan itself isn't the whole answer. We then put that together with your other risk factors and then looked at that to see whether you are at risk of fractures because of your bone strength. And that's really what we then look at in terms of treating anything. It's, are we able to prevent fractures because of the bone strength that you have?
Yeah, I was listening to you. My sort of next thought was, is it advisable, sort of as a matter of fact, that sort of say once you get to about 40 and beyond, that you have, or is it even offered, especially in the UK on the NHS, regular DEXA scans just to kind of see how things are? Or is that only a sort of private option, or only when you have a breakage and it's kind of too late?
So we don't because the DEXA scan itself gives us a number, but it's not very meaningful. Regular scans to survey for this isn't shown to be of any particular benefit, except in really specific groups. So women who have completed menopause early, so we're talking about completing menopause before the age of 40, ought to have a DEXA scan as part of their management, because they're going to have started their bone loss quite a lot earlier than your average woman. And we also know that in that group, the way in which estrogen drops off may promote a greater amount of bone loss than you might otherwise see in menopause. So they have a specific group of risks associated for those. Also, women who have to take a lot of steroid medication, because then we know that they have that combined risk factor. And if you are starting medication that might affect your bone density, then your doctor may suggest getting a bone scan to understand where ground zero is at this point in time, before adding in something which we know is more likely to contribute to bone loss, because that may be the time that it's worth adding in something to help prevent that bone loss in addition. But as a matter of routine, we don't look at bone density because it in itself doesn't really tell us very much, and it in itself wouldn't direct whether we're going to do something different. And as I'm sure we're going to come on to, so much of what we can do is actually totally in our own control, and actually doesn't need us to have any kind of measurement to know that we ought to be doing it. We tend to look at that sort of change first, rather than just getting a scan with the risks that go with any sort of imaging scan, without really having a good use for it afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, you led beautifully onto my next question was what are some of the lifestyle factors that we can all do to prevent our risk? And obviously, you know, let's have a look at the sort of risk factors. I mean, I'm assuming things like smoking, for example, can't help. But yeah.
You're absolutely right. So I think one of the great things about looking at how we can support our own bone strength is that actually it is the formation of great lifestyle choices. So there isn't really anything particular you need to do to have strong bones that you wouldn't already want to be doing to have strong everything else. So at least there's not something very specific really for bone strength that is outside the other things that we talk about. But it's great to go through them one by one. So you've already touched on one. Yeah, smoking we know isn't great for us in lots of ways, but we also know it affects the relationship between these building and breaking down cells. So stopping smoking is a great starting point. We also know that alcohol can affect our bone strength. We don't quite know the mechanism for that, but again, it's some form of interaction between this bone growth and bone loss. So reducing the amount of alcohol that you're drinking also helps to reduce your risk of bone loss. Then we've got what we eat. So a healthy diet with all that means. So the rainbow on your plate, making sure you're eating a mixture of vitamins and minerals, so a variety of different colors of fruits and vegetables is a great way of assuring that you get enough of what you need. But if we look at what does enough mean, well, calcium and vitamin D for bone strength is what we're really talking about. So calcium, we're looking at about 1,200 milligrams per day for menopausal women. We get most of our calcium from things like dairy, green leafy vegetables, but also things like almonds, sesame seeds. Sardines are a great, and we talk about sardines for so many things. So again, it's another useful thing to be getting out of the sardines that you're having. But pulses, tofu even also have calcium in. And so many foods are now fortified and enriched with calcium as well. So there's lots of ways that you can get your calcium into your diet. Vitamin D is the interesting one because, as you touched on, vitamin D is something that we make in our skin when it's exposed to sunlight. And we hear a lot more conversation about the fact that that's harder for us to do in the UK. And it's harder for lots of good reasons, as well as ones that are related to the amount of sunshine we do or don't get over here. So we're looking at having about 10 micrograms per day. And you can get some of that in your food, but not all of it. A good amount of safe sunlight actually only looks like 10 minutes twice a day without sunscreen and being very careful not to burn. And that's the key point. You don't want to be trading one thing for another problem, and skin cancer is still on the rise in the UK, so we still need to be mindful of that. But because we are now so good at covering up, the slip, slop, slap message has definitely got home, then actually that use of sunblock can be one of the reasons why we find it more difficult to get vitamin D production, even though we might be out in the sun. But it is only 10 minutes, and it might just be having your forearms exposed. It doesn't need to be, you know, getting out in your bikini and spending hours in the sunshine. It's short, sharp doses of sunlight. But we also know in the UK that the sunlight simply isn't enough between about October and March. So the government advice now is that actually everybody in the UK should be taking vitamin D supplementation, at least in those later autumn and winter months, to make up for the fact that the strength of the sun just isn't enough for us to produce enough vitamin D. And because we don't tend to get enough vitamin D out of our food in a way that we can process and absorb. So definitely thinking about increasing those leafy greens, increasing those nuts and pulses, increasing your sardines are a great way of doing it as well if you'd rather not be taking a supplement. And then there are a variety of supplements out there if that was what you wanted to do. Some of them are also vegan if that is of concern. So you have different options. It's just important to understand how much you're getting in the totality. And for some people who do use regular sunblock, who are very good at covering up in the sun and making sure that they don't run the risk of skin cancer, then actually they're recommended to take vitamin D all year round, as are those with darker skin who do find it more difficult to produce enough vitamin D in the UK.
I mean, that's really helpful. And, you know, I actually take a vitamin D supplement every day. But obviously, we've got lots of information, by the way, if anyone's interested, on our website and through the Latte Lounge Plus, which is powered by you guys at Stella. There's so much information about, you know, supplements and osteoporosis and and things to do, risk factors and everything. So I hope, people will spend a bit of time afterwards having looked at all those resources. What about, before we go on to medical interventions, what about exercise and bone strengthening exercise? What can we do to help that side of things?
So this is really key to keeping our bones active. If we remember that it's this constant dance of breaking down and remodeling that's always going on, even if the rates of those two things are changing. So we're talking about two different sorts of exercise that both are important for bone strength. We've got muscle strengthening and we've got weight bearing. So weight bearing is where you are putting literally weight through your entire skeleton. That is constantly stressing all the bones in your body through that weight bearing exercise. And weight bearing comes into impact. That's where we're getting the impact on the strength of our bones. So low impact exercise would be things like walking, even if that's quickly, it's still quite a low impact. It might be stamping or marching, stair climbing. Those are actually still quite low impact. Moderate impact might be things like jogging, running, racket sports, where you are launching yourself and dropping heavily onto your skeleton, onto your feet. And then high impact is where there's even more of that. So that might be things like doing star jumps, tuck jumps. It might be joining in with volleyball or netball, things like that. Things that have you jumping quite high a lot and landing and impacting. And that constant action on your skeleton is what really starts to reinforce the bone development and stimulate more growth than the loss phase. So that's your weight bearing. Then you've got your muscle strengthening. And the reason that's important is because as we strengthen our muscles, in order to strengthen them, they have to pull on the bones. That's what stops them from just flapping around in the breeze and makes our joints work. So that's, if you are improving your muscle strength, you will be pulling on the bones, and the pull on the bones stimulates more of that build phase. So that again is a way of just making sure that you're really improving that. And if we look at progressive muscle strengthening, so muscle resistance training, then that increases the strength of your muscles, which means as they're working, they will pull harder on your bones, as well as during the actual exercise where they are already pulling hard on your bones. So that's the sort of thing where you're using weights, or you might be using resistance bands, or using your body weight, but on a particular group of muscles, like if you're doing press ups. So you're encouraging not your whole body weight, but particular muscle groups to really strengthen. And it's looking at the whole of your skeleton, because this is going to make an impact on the particular bones attached to the ends of the muscles that you're strengthening. So you can't just do upper body work and hope that will fix your hips. You're looking at doing this muscle strengthening exercise throughout your body. And I think this is probably the one bit where it does start to get a little bit harder when we're talking about the real nuts and bolts of how we actually make a difference to our bone strength, because it's the amount of exercise that you're looking to do that I think everyone thinks, well, yeah, I get the concept of what I'm supposed to be doing, but actually, how much do I need to do? And the Royal Osteoporosis Society have an amazing website and a phenomenal set of resources to look out for all of this. But their guidance would be that if you've already got osteoporosis, you should be looking at doing about 50 moderate impacts on most days. And if you have more progressive osteoporosis, so evidence of fractures, then that reduces just because of that fracture risk. So if you imagine that if you've already got weaker bones, then we're talking about 50 moderate impacts. If you haven't, to keep them healthy, we're looking at even more than that. So you're looking at least 50 impacts, but that could literally be 50 jumps up and down. That could be really energetic dancing that you're doing up and down, 50 actual impacts, not 50 minutes, just 50 impacts. That sorts out your weight bearing element. Then your muscle strength training, we're talking about on 2 or 3 days of the week. So not necessarily day to day, but just 2 or 3 days in the week, looking at about 20 to 30 minutes of some form of muscle resistance exercise work. So with weights, with resistance bands, doing press ups, that kind of thing, for between 20 and 30 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week. So that is something then that you're trying to actively build into your schedule. And if you've never done any muscle resistance work before, you might want to think about finding a class, joining a gym, getting a trainer that can help guide you through how to do that safely. Because as with all exercise, there is a risk if you just start cold without really knowing what you're doing, you could do your joints and your muscles more harm than you're hoping to benefit from in terms of your stronger bones. So just making sure you're doing those movements safely and effectively can be a real benefit. Just getting the knack, and then you're fine to carry on your own.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, when I said right back at the beginning that I started running at 40, I think it's always quite important to have a checkup with your doctor, you know, if you start to feel any issues. I mean, for me, running was not the right thing because I had hip dysplasia, and actually I was just causing, you know, the bone to rub on bone, and that wasn't helpful. But I mean, what was helpful for me, and I do lots of exercise as well, but I do low impact exercise, was this introduction of hormone replacement therapy, HRT. Now, I know there's a lot of women that can't take it or don't want to, and we'll go on to that in a minute. But, you know, there's so much talk in the media and obviously on all the sort of BMS websites and all the reputable sites that HRT can prevent osteoporosis. Is that true, or does it just sort of help prevent fractures?
So all of these things will help to strengthen the bone. That's what we're trying to do, and that in turn will help to lessen the risk of having fractures. And yeah, HRT has been demonstrated to probably be as effective as some of the other main classes of medications that you might see used in the management of osteoporosis. And the logic of it seems to make sense. What the estrogen that you're replacing through HRT is doing is helping to keep the dance of breakdown and remodeling all keeping in tune as it has done up till your menopause. So your estrogen coming from HRT is doing the same as your estrogen was doing when you were taking it internally. It's just helping to promote that. So it keeps your bones stronger for longer is what HRT is doing. Now, we do know that when you stop taking HRT, just like when you have menopause, that you will start to get the bone loss that's going to come anyway. And I think that's the key bit, that this is a lifelong journey. Most people who live into their 90s will have osteoporosis, men and women, simply because of age. So what HRT is doing is really helping to keep you on a great level for as long as you're willing to take the HRT for, before that natural process of bone loss starts to kick in and have more impact. But we also know that with menopause that we see quite a rapid decline, but then it stabilizes out. So it becomes much more like the steady loss that men will see. So we see this big drop, but then we see it steady out. What's interesting about HRT, but not as studied, is that we think there is a longer window of protection. So even if you stop HRT today, you may have quite a long tail of protection on that bone strength, but that needs a bit more research yet. But certainly we know that HRT, in having the estrogen back that you are losing, then we can see the benefit in the same way that your natural estrogen was playing before you became menopausal. Now, in terms of doses and formats, sorry, you were probably going to ask exactly that.
Carry on.
So any format of HRT is fine. If it is controlling other symptoms that you have, it will be enough for bone strength. So if you have hot flushes, if you have any of the other symptoms that you're using HRT for, then that will be enough. If you are lucky to not have any other symptoms and you're under 60 and are still looking to use HRT for its protection on bone strength, then actually quite low doses of estrogen will be protective, and we see a benefit from that in bone strength. Once you hit 60, if you're not symptomatic from anything else, we're going to be less inclined to use HRT itself just for bone strength, because we know that we see the tip over of other risks associated with HRT as you get older, if you're not using it to benefit in any other way. So that's when we start looking at the risk benefit of HRT as compared to other medications if you haven't yet started HRT before the age of 60. So it's any format for any reason under the age of 60. And if it's controlling other symptoms, it will be enough. If you don't have any other symptoms, actually low dose may be all that you need to control your bone growth.
And are there any other medications that you would consider in that instance that can help?
So there are a whole range of different medications that are now used in the management of osteoporosis. And there are the standard treatments that people will use. So you may have heard of bisphosphonates, things like alendronic acid or Fosamax is a really common one for people to be using. But actually, there are lots of different medications, all trying to target different parts of this pathway. So whether it's trying to get the grow cells to grow more, or the bone loss cells to stop working, or a balance of both of those, or whether they're trying to encourage the absorption of calcium and vitamin D, or stop the problems that are leading to you not being able to absorb those well. Different medications tackle the problem in different ways, and that's where working with your doctor on what's the best type of medication for your particular situation, your particular risk factors, is where it's so important to have that personalized to you and what you need.
Yeah, and lastly, you know, and obviously I don't want to keep you for too long, but this is such a fantastic chat, and I think a lot of people are going to find it very helpful. On that sort of topic of sort of individual, sort of a joint informed sort of conversation with your healthcare practitioner, if there's a strong family history of it, or if you already know you've got osteoporosis, is there a way to reverse the sort of severity at all?
So the hard thing is that we can't change our genes. So what you've got is what you've got. What you can do is optimize what you've got. So if we all recognize that we do most of our bone growth as children and young adults, probably by the time we've hit about 25, we've done the majority of our bone strength development. So we are growing more than we're losing at that point. And then somewhere between 35 and 45, for most people, men and women, we start to lose more than we grow. The more you can do to help prevent that loss by doing all the exercise, by keeping your diet good, by reducing your alcohol, reducing your smoking, then actually the more you are likely to have a bigger impact than your genes would have had. So we can't reverse the impact of our genes and reverse the impact of what lot we get dealt with. But absolutely, that lifestyle bit is the bit that is so critical at helping to keep our bone density as strong as possible for as long as possible. So it doesn't matter what your age you are right now as you sit here watching this, the key is to get those lifestyle measures in check, because that is what is going to make a big difference. For some with very specific risk factors, the ones that we've discussed about other medications or other medical conditions, combined with being female, or perhaps combined with an early menopause, then there may be worth in starting medications earlier for those individuals before they've had any fractures. But most of what we look at is really about preventing getting to that first fracture. And the way to do that is absolutely through those lifestyle measures. They will make the biggest impact, and they will be the ones that reverse the impact that your genes are having.
Yeah, and I think for anyone listening, perhaps if they've been through, whether it's a surgical menopause or had cancer treatment, I know a lot of women post-cancer treatment, whether they've had tamoxifen or chemo, you know, that can impact on the bones as well. And I think, you know, the take-home message for me, and I'm sure you'll agree, is that it's about these individual sort of risk factors and conversations, which sometimes, you know, you GPs are just fantastic, but especially here in the UK on the NHS, you've got these very short windows, 10-minute appointments where you can't go into as much depth as you would like. So just before I let you go, I just thought it would be really helpful to explain to everyone a little bit more about the Latte Lounge Plus, which is powered by you fabulous doctors at Stella. How would an appointment, you know, particularly those who are worried about osteoporosis, work? I mean, what would their sort of first sensible, I suppose, action be to take to perhaps have a more in-depth conversation with you?
So I think the great thing about working with the Latte Lounge and having the ability to speak to women from the group is that in the appointments we have with Stella Plus, we have longer to talk to you, which means we have longer for you to think through and start to articulate the challenges that you're having and the concerns that you've got without needing to have got it all perfectly straight in your mind before you come into the appointment, which I think is where most people get anxious about going to see their own GPs, that how do I make sure that I can use that 10 minutes really constructively and be absolutely ready for it. So longer time means that you can talk through those things. Now, we won't manage the medication that goes through with osteoporosis through Stella Plus, but what we can absolutely do is talk about the pros and cons, look at whether HRT is something that is or isn't suitable for you, and help you construct that conversation to take to your doctor about the risk factors, as all doctors can look at these risk factors, so we can all talk about where you sit in that and help you to get to a point where you're better informed about what it is you might be looking for out of this. Because for some people, it will be just about talking through, well, these are the risks. This is what happened to my gran. This is what I can see happening to my mum, and I just don't want that for me. What can I do? And that may not need to involve any medication at all. It may be about, yeah, absolutely. What you're doing now is absolutely right. These would be the reasons to then go and see your GP later. Or it might be, I am really anxious. My lifestyle means that I'm at increased risk of falling. Maybe you have inherent balance problems, or you're worried about that. Then it can be a much more tailored conversation, again, that you can then work out exactly what is it that we need to take back to our doctors. And on the Royal Society for Osteoporosis website, they have a great risk factor calculator on the website, which again produces a report which they recommend that you can then take to your doctor to help lead into that conversation, whether that's with us or with your own doctor. Then again, it's a way of being able to think through some of these things ahead of time to shape up how you want to use the time with any doctor to then talk about what's next. But the great thing about working with us is that you do get longer, which means you can be more relaxed about how you shape up and form those thoughts. But the key thing for me with any of this is go and see somebody. If you're worried, talk it out. Make sure that you find what is right for you. And I'd love it to come and talk to one of our team. But if that's not right for you, I'd rather you were seeing somebody than nobody.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, this has been so helpful. And for everyone listening on the podcast, you will know that we will put all this information in our show notes, and we always create a blog as well for our website. And you can watch the video conversation on our YouTube channel. So if you want to recap and go over anything Kate and I have been talking about, you can do so. So look, thank you so much again for joining us and sharing your knowledge, Kate. And if anyone wants to find out more, obviously, about the Latte Lounge Plus, it's on stella.com /the-latte-lounge but we'll put all of this in the show notes again. So thank you, Kate, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Latte Lounge podcast. Please subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss our next episode. For more support with all things menopause and midlife, head to our website, lattelounge.co.uk, and search for the Latte Lounge group on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by Youth and Earth and produced by Emily Crosby Media.